What would it take to convince a populace to change its nationality? What would it take to convince you to accept an alternate national identity? Before America could declare independence, Americans had to be persuaded to imagine themselves differently. That idea might sound obvious today, but in early 1776, it was not obvious at all. So many colonists were angry at Parliament, many distrusted British policy, and many believed their rights had been violated. But independence, that was still a far cry. Hello, fellow historians. I'm Andrea Henderson, and today let's talk about the Thomases. That's right, Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Paine's purpose in writing Common Sense wasn't just to complain about Britain. Plenty of colonists had already done that. So his deeper work was to convince Americans that they weren't just injured British subjects. They were becoming a separate people with a separate future. And Jefferson's declaration does something different. It takes that emerging sense of American identity and translates it into something formal language of law and rights and international politics. Paine pushes Americans towards independence in January of 1776, and Jefferson announces that independence to the world 6 months later. So the two texts are connected, but they're not quite the same in terms of function. Paine's first effort, we'll say, in Common Sense is to attack the monarchy itself. He argues that monarchy and hereditary succession are irrational, unnatural, and dangerous. And for Paine, government exists to provide security and to protect society. But monarchy corrupts that purpose by placing power in the hands of one person and one family. He wants his audience to stop seeing kingship as normal. Breaking an old habit of thought, though, is not easy, especially when you're talking about an entire populace. Many colonists still imagine themselves inside the British constitutional world, and Paine is trying to sever that mental connection. Hogan and Williams, in their article Republican Charisma and the American Revolution, the textual persona of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, they help explain why this worked. They argue that Common Sense created a kind of Republican charisma. Paine didn't write as a distant elite figure. The pamphlet was actually originally anonymous in its publication, and its power came from its plain and direct style. It sounded less like a great man speaking down to the people and more like the people's own common judgment, finally being spoken out loud. Paine's second effort is to redefine America itself. He rejects the idea that Britain is America's true parent country. Instead, he argues that America was populated by people from across Europe, many of whom came seeking civil and religious liberty. In other words, Americans are not simply transplanted Englishmen. This is one of Paine's most important arguments for nationality. He's saying that America has its own geography, its own interests, its own population, and its own destiny. His famous image is simple but powerful. It makes no sense for a continent to be permanently governed by an island. Paine's third effort is to argue that reconciliation is no longer realistic. After bloodshed, rejected petitions, and military conflict, union with Britain has become forced and unnatural. Paine presents independence as the practical choice. The colonies have already crossed the line. Jefferson's declaration begins from that same basic idea, but addresses a different audience and with a different tone. Jefferson is not writing a pamphlet to stir ordinary readers in the same way that Paine is. He's writing on behalf of Congress. And the declaration opens by saying that when it becomes necessary for people to dissolve the political bands with one another, they should explain their reasons out of respect for mankind. So Jefferson doesn't begin with taxes or specific complaints. He begins with people. Americans are presented as a collective political body capable of entering the world as a separate and equal power. Next, Jefferson explains the principles that justify that separation. The Declaration states that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that governments derive their powers from the consent of the governed. And if a government becomes destructive of these ends, the people may alter or abolish it. Pauline Maier, in her article The Strange History of All Men Are Created Equal, warns us not to read the Declaration only through the later history of the phrase, all men are created equal. That phrase became central later, especially in debates over slavery and equality. But in 1776, Maier argues, the Declaration's immediate purpose was to justify independence and announce that the colonies had become free and independent states. So Jefferson's point is not abstract philosophy for its own sake. He's building a case, like the attorney he was. If governments exist by consent, and if Britain violated that consent, then Americans have the right to form a new government. In Jefferson's list of grievances, he presents George III as a ruler who has repeatedly violated colonial rights and institutions. He refused laws, dissolved representative houses, obstructed justice, imposed taxes without consent, kept standing armies among the people, and waged war against them. The list is long on purpose. Jefferson is saying the pattern proves the case. The king's actions reveal a design to reduce the colonies under tyranny. And at that point, separation becomes not only a right, but a duty. This is where Paine and Jefferson overlap a bit, and both of them argue that the relationship with Britain has been broken and it's beyond repair. Paine says reconciliation is a fantasy, preparing Americans emotionally and politically. His language is urgent, sharp, and popular. He wants people to feel the absurdity of monarchy and the necessity of separation. Jefferson, on the other hand, says repeated petitions have produced only repeated injury, attempting to make independence legitimate. His language is formal and legal and diplomatic. He wants the world to understand that Americans are not merely rebelling. They're acting as a people with rights, grievances, and political authority. So put simply, Paine creates revolutionary imagination. It's like thoughts that precede action. The more you think about something, the more likely you are to act on those thoughts. Jefferson gives that imagination constitutional and international form, the action people can see and read. Paine tells Americans, you're already becoming a new people. Jefferson tells the world, this people is now a new nation. Thanks for watching.